Throughout history, humanity has never stopped fighting, not only to defend its lands but to prove its intelligence, courage, and will to survive. Every battle carries untold stories, bold strategies, fatal mistakes, and moments that change the course of the world. Here on Military Tactics channel, we revisit those pages of history to understand why sometimes a single decision can create a legend. Let's begin today's story. In September of 1943, 4 million soldiers raced toward Europe's fourth longest river. The Germans called it their Eastern Wall, the barrier that would stop the Red Army cold. But Field Marshal von Manstein knew the truth. His armies were running toward nothing. The fortifications Hitler had promised existed only on paper. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a 2,000-kilometer catastrophe that would unfold across 60 days of unrelenting horror. More soldiers would die here than at Stalingrad and Kursk combined. The Dnieper would become the graveyard of German defensive doctrine, the place where the Wehrmacht learned they would never stop running again. This is the story of how Hitler's last hope became Germany's greatest disaster. How an entire army ran toward salvation that didn't exist. How a river meant to save the Third Reich instead drowned it in blood. July of 1943. Kursk. The Wehrmacht threw everything into one last offensive. Operation Citadel, Hitler's final gamble to regain the initiative in the east. They lost completely. 500,000 German soldiers never came home. Thousands of tanks, Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, turned to scrap metal in the Ukrainian wheat fields. The Luftwaffe burned through pilots it couldn't replace. Entire divisions that had conquered France and Poland simply ceased to exist. Germany's offensive power died in those burning fields. But Stalin didn't pause. Not for one day. Not for 1 hour. On August 3rd, while German commanders still counted, their dead 5 Soviet fronts started moving. Nearly 4 million men surged forward. More tanks than Germany could build in a year rolled west. Their new strategy was revolutionary. In its simplicity, forget the complex encirclements that had defined earlier Soviet operations. Just take territory fast, relentlessly. Give the Germans no time to regroup, no time to think, no time to build defenses. General Zhukov gathered his commanders and laid out the new doctrine: chase them. Don't let them breathe. Don't let them dig in. Every hour they run, they grow weaker. Every kilometer we advance, we grow stronger. The mathematics of war had shifted catastrophically against Germany. Soviet factories were pumping out 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed. The T-34 seconds rolled off production lines in the Urals every 4 hours. American Lend-Lease trucks, 400,000 of them, carried Soviet infantry forward at speeds the horse-drawn Wehrmacht couldn't match. The Wehrmacht had no reserves, left nothing. The strategic reserve that had saved them so many times before no longer existed. A German officer, Major Klaus Becker, wrote to his wife, "We used to attack, now we just run. We used to choose where to fight. Now we fight wherever they catch us." Colonel Hans Funluck, watching the Soviet tide approach, recorded in his diary, "It's not an army advancing anymore. It's a force of nature, like trying to stop the ocean with your bare hands." Therefore, when von Manstein looked at his maps in early August, he saw disaster approaching like a thunderstorm, 5 red arrows converging on his exhausted divisions. Each arrow represented a Soviet front, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, endless artillery. His army group south had no reserves to stop them, no fresh divisions hidden in the rear. His only option: retreat to the Dnieper and pray the promised fortifications were real. But even as his men began their desperate march west, Manstein suspected the terrible truth. For 2 years, Hitler had forbidden any talk of defensive lines in the east. Building fortifications meant admitting the Wehrmacht might retreat. That was defeatist thinking, punishable by death. Hitler lived in a fantasy where every meter of conquered soil was sacred. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, surrounded by maps showing divisions that no longer existed, he issued impossible orders to hold positions that had already fallen. Any general who suggested building defenses was branded a coward. Several were shot. But on August 11, 1943, with Soviets charging across Ukraine like wolves sensing wounded prey, Hitler finally gave the order: build the eastern wall along the Dnieper, make it impregnable, turn the river into a fortress that would break the Red Army. The order read like fiction. Construct concrete bunkers at 500-meter intervals, install anti-tank obstacles to a depth of 10 kilometers, create interlocking fields of fire, and mine all approaches. Position artillery in hardened emplacement placements. Local commanders read the order and laughed or cried. Some did both. They had 6 weeks to build what the Atlantic Wall took 3 years to construct. They had no concrete. The factories were rubble, no steel. It all went to tank production, no engineers. They were dead at Kursk, their bodies rotting in tank trenches. The organization chief who could have managed such a project, Fritz Todt, had died in a mysterious plane crash. His replacement was a Nazi party hack who had never built anything larger than a garage. Major General Friedrich von Mellenten called it building a castle out of sand while the tide rolls in. Another officer was more direct. We've been ordered to stop the Soviets with wishes and fairy tales. The reality was worse than just a lack of materials. The German construction battalions that should have built these fortifications were already in full retreat. The slave laborers who might have dug trenches had fled or joined partisan groups. Local commanders found themselves with orders to build fortifications, but no hands to build them, no tools to build, with no materials to use. Manstein knew the truth. In his diary he wrote, "The Ostwall is fiction. We retreat toward nothing but a river and death." But he had no choice. 2 million Soviets were chasing his men. They needed those fortifications to exist, even if only in their imagination. Hope, even false hope, was all that kept his men moving. A staff officer remembered Manstein staring at the Dnieper on his map, tracing the river with his finger and saying quietly, "This is where the Reich dies." Therefore, German soldiers marched toward the Dnieper, believing salvation waited there. Their officers knew better, but said nothing. What would be the point of telling exhausted men that their last hope was a lie? September of 1943. The retreat turned into a race, then into a rout. Soviet tanks advanced 20 kilometers every single day. German infantry couldn't march that fast. Their feet bled through torn boots. Horses collapsed and were left to die. Trucks ran out of fuel and were pushed into ravines. Men threw away everything: ammunition, food, weapons, even photographs of loved ones, just to move faster. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was dissolving like snow and rain. Manstein ordered scorched earth: burn everything. Destroy every bridge, every railway, every building. Every well was to be poisoned, every grain silo burned. Leave nothing for the Soviets but ashes and death. German pioneer units worked with systematic cruelty. They dynamited the massive Zaporizhzhia Dam. Millions of tons of water flooded Ukrainian farmland. Entire villages vanished underwater. Thousands of civilians drowned in their homes. The Wehrmacht burned grain fields that could have fed millions through the coming winter. They slaughtered livestock and threw the carcasses into wells. They turned Ukraine into a wasteland. A Ukrainian survivor, Oksana Marenko, remembered, "First they stole everything, then they burned everything. Then they mined the ashes so we couldn't even search for food." But the Soviets kept coming. General Vatutin's tanks didn't stop for destroyed bridges. His engineers built new ones in hours using American-supplied equipment. General K.'s infantry didn't stop for burned villages. They carried their own supplies in endless convoys of Studebaker trucks. General Rokossovsky pushed from the north like a hammer striking an anvil. Stalin had promised medals to whoever reached the Dnieper first. More than medals, glory, promotion, or their names in history, Soviet commanders raced each other toward glory, pushing their exhausted men beyond human limits. Tank crews drove 20 hours straight, falling asleep at their controls. Infantry marched until they collapsed, were loaded onto trucks, then marched again when they woke. Meanwhile, German units were dissolving into chaos. The 99th Panzer Division started the retreat with 100 tanks. By mid-September, they had 12 working vehicles. The 257th Infantry Division could only account for 2,000 men out of 10,000. No one knew if the rest were dead, captured, or simply lost in the vastness of the steppe. Sergeant Hans Miller kept a diary that survived the war. September 10th. Threw away my extra ammunition. Too heavy. September 12th. Left the field kitchen behind. No fuel to pull it. September 14th. Abandoned the wounded. God forgive us. September 15th. I see the Dnieper. Thank God. September 16th. There are no fortifications. We're all dead. The retreat spawned its own horrors. German military police shot deserters, often just exhausted soldiers who had fallen behind. Partisan attacks increased daily. Every forest might hide Soviet raiders. Every village might be a trap. The Wehrmacht wasn't an army anymore. It was a mob running west. Therefore, by September 20th, the first German units reached the river they thought would save them. What they found would destroy the last remnants of hope. The first German soldiers to reach the Dnieper couldn't believe their eyes. No bunkers, no trenches, no barbed wire, no minefields, no artillery positions, nothing. Just 3 kilometers of open water and bare riverbank. Empty fields, a few Ukrainian fishing villages abandoned and burned. The Eastern Wall, Hitler's impregnable barrier, the fortress that would stop the Red Army, didn't exist, had never existed, would never exist. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote home what would be his last letter. They promised us fortifications. We found dirt and water. We're dead men walking. The Dnieper was wide, yes, in some places, 3 kilometers across the third largest river in Europe, flowing from Russia to the Black Sea. In normal times, it would be a formidable obstacle, but September of 1943 brought the worst drought in decades. Water levels were the lowest anyone could remember. Sandbars appeared where deep channels should have flowed. A determined man could wade across at dozens of points. The river that was supposed to save Germany was barely deeper than a tall man in many places. Worse, the Wehrmacht had destroyed its own bridging equipment during the retreat. Following standard doctrine, they had blown up or abandoned their pontoon bridges to slow the Soviets. Now they couldn't even cross to the western bank properly. German engineers had to swim across with ropes, building makeshift ferries under constant Soviet artillery fire. Men drowned trying to string cables across the current. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Baumann of the 72nd Infantry Division recorded the scene. We arrived at our fortress to find nothing but mud. The men looked at me waiting for orders. What could I say? Dig in with your helmets. Hold the river with rifles against tanks. I told them to dig foxholes and pray. Within hours of the Germans arriving, Soviet reconnaissance units appeared on the eastern bank. They saw the same thing. No defenses, just exhausted German soldiers trying to dig foxholes with their helmets and bare hands. Some Germans hadn't even crossed the river yet. They were still milling on the eastern bank, unsure what to do. Soviet scouts couldn't believe their luck. One radioed back, "The fascists have nothing. Repeat, nothing. Just men and rifles. Request immediate assault." The German soldiers knew they were doomed. A Wehrmacht corporal named Friedrich wrote in a letter found on his body, "We ran 400 kilometers to reach safety. There is no safety, only a river we can't defend. Mother, I won't see Christmas." Therefore, Soviet commanders immediately ordered cross now everywhere before the Germans could organize even basic defenses. September 22, 1943. 2 o'clock a.m. Darkness across the Dnieper. The first Soviet soldier slipped into the dark water. Then another, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The Red Army didn't wait for boats. Soldiers crossed on logs, doors ripped from houses, barn roofs, anything that floated. Some just swam, holding rifles above their heads, grenades in their teeth. They crossed at night in fog under artillery barrages. Whenever Germans couldn't see them clearly, Private Ivan Cherishvili, who survived the crossing at KV, remembered, "The water was cold. So cold. My fingers went numb, holding my rifle up. Around me men were drowning, but we kept swimming." The commissar had said, "The motherland needs the western bank." So we swam. The Soviets attacked the river at multiple points simultaneously. Not 10 crossings, not 50. They attempted crossings everywhere they could. By September 24th, Soviet units had established beachheads at dozens of locations along the entire front. At Novopetrovka, a Soviet battalion crossed using coffins stolen from a cemetery. At Gradsk, combat engineers lashed together a bridge from destroyed German vehicles. Near Cherkasy, an entire regiment crossed by walking across a dam the Germans had failed to destroy. Manstein couldn't respond. He had one exhausted division for every 30 kilometers of river. To stop a single crossing required 3 divisions concentrated at one point. The mathematics were impossible. It was like trying to stop rain with a tennis racket. He tried anyway. The 24th Panzer Division raced to crush a bridgehead at Buchanan. They arrived to find not 1 crossing but 5. The 7th Panzer attacked crossings near Kremenchuk. While they were engaged, Soviets crossed 10 kilometers north and south. But Stalin wanted faster progress. He ordered the 3rd Guards Airborne Corps dropped behind German lines at Buchanan. It became a massacre. Transport planes flew into German flak without fighter escort. Paratroopers dropped into swamps, onto German positions into the river itself. Of 4,500 Soviet paratroopers, 901 were captured or killed in 24 hours, their bodies hanging from trees where German troops displayed them as warnings. The rest scattered into forests, hunted like animals by German rearguard units and Ukrainian collaborators. Yet even this disaster couldn't stop the river crossings. The failed airborne operation actually helped. It drew German reserves away from the river itself. Lieutenant Pavel Nikonov led 40 men across near Kremenchuk using a stolen fishing boat. They held their bridgehead against 2 German companies for 3 days, until relief arrived. Only 3 survived. All 40 became heroes of the Soviet Union mostly. A German officer, Major Otto Kretschmer, reported to headquarters, "They're crossing everywhere. We shoot them in the water. More keep coming. We run to stop a crossing in the north. They cross in the south. We have no reserves, no ammunition. The men haven't slept in 5 days. This is not a battle anymore, it's a nightmare." By September 30th, the Red Army had established 23 major bridgeheads on the western bank. Each one was a dagger pointed at Germany's heart. Therefore, within 1 week, what Berlin called an impregnable barrier had become a sieve leaking Soviet armies. October of 1943, the bridgeheads started connecting like spreading cancer. What began as isolated footholds became a continuous Soviet-controlled western bank. German counterattacks failed catastrophically. They had no tanks. Most were destroyed in the retreat. They had no air support. The Luftwaffe was fighting for its life over Germany itself, trying to stop Allied bombers from erasing German cities. Army Group South stretched across 700 kilometers, 1 division per 30 kilometers. Doctrine demanded 1 division per 10 kilometers maximum. The math meant death. German artillery had no shells. Units reported firing their last rounds and using anti-tank guns as makeshift artillery. Some positions defended themselves with captured Soviet weapons because German supply lines had completely collapsed. Manstein sent Hitler desperate telegrams, "Cannot hold. Request permission to withdraw to the Bug River." Hitler's response, "Hold at all costs. We have no reserves. Repeat, no reserves. Hitler, find reserves. Hold the line. The line doesn't exist." Hitler stopped responding, but there was nothing left to hold with. The 24th Panzer Division had 8 working tanks and was calling itself a Panzer Division out of habit. The 46th Infantry had lost 2/3 of its men and merged with remnants of 3 other shattered divisions. Some companies were down to 30 soldiers commanding themselves because all officers were dead. Soviet artillery dominated the river. Thousands of guns fired day and night. The bombardments could be heard in Romania. German soldiers couldn't move in daylight. They couldn't bring up supplies. They couldn't evacuate the wounded. They could only watch as more Soviet divisions poured across their so-called impregnable river, General KVs. Troops took Kremenchuk. On September 29th, Vatutin's forces surrounded German units at Cherkasy. Rokossovsky pushed toward Kiev. The Wehrmacht wasn't fighting anymore. They were drowning in a red tide. Colonel Ernst von Reichow wrote the last entry in his unit diary October 12th. "Soviets crossing in our sector in division strength. No reserves, no ammunition, artillery destroyed, most officers dead. May God help Germany, for we cannot." A German private named Joseph remembered, "We could see them building bridges. Hundreds of men working in daylight. We had nothing to stop them with. I fired my rifle at them until I had no bullets. Then, I just watched them come." Therefore, by mid-October, the Dnieper defense had collapsed completely. The race was over. Germany had lost. 4 million soldiers fought at the Dnieper. Roughly 450,000 were killed or missing. The river ran red for weeks. The Germans lost 400,000 men they could never replace. The Wehrmacht of 1943 died on the Dnieper's banks. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist. The 79th Infantry Division destroyed the 4th Panzer Division, combat ineffective. The 8th Army shattered beyond recognition. Veterans who survived describe scenes from hell. Bodies floated down the river for weeks. The riverbanks were carpeted with the dead. Ukrainian civilians were forced to dig mass graves that stretched for kilometers. The stench of death could be smelled 20 kilometers away. Soviet losses were staggering too. Entire regiments vanished in the crossing attempts. But behind every dead Soviet soldier stood 3 more. Behind every destroyed Soviet tank rolled 5 new ones from the Urals. The Red Army could absorb these losses. The Wehrmacht couldn't. By December, left bank Ukraine was liberated. Every major Ukrainian city east of the Dnieper flew the red flag. Kyiv fell on November 6th, just in time for the anniversary of the October Revolution. Stalin celebrated with a 324-gun salute in Moscow. The Soviet Union had reclaimed its industrial heartland. The human cost was written in graves stretching from Kursk to Kyiv. Villages that once held thousands now held dozens. Fields that should have grown wheat grew crosses instead. The scorched earth tactics left millions of civilians facing starvation. The winter of 1943-44 would kill almost as many Ukrainians as the battle itself. Maria Petrovna, a survivor from a village near Chasy, remembered, "First the Germans burned everything when they retreated. Then came the battle shells day and night. Then came winter. We ate grass. We ate bark from trees. We boiled leather shoes for soup. Half our village died not from bullets but from hunger. The strategic implications were even greater than the human cost." After the Dnieper, Germany never again held the initiative in the east. Every subsequent defensive line would fail. The Soviets had learned they could break any German position. The Germans had learned they could hold nothing. Therefore, the Battle of the Dnieper achieved what Stalingrad and Kursk had started: the complete irreversible destruction of German power in the east. The Dnieper was meant to save the Wehrmacht. Instead, it destroyed it forever. Hitler imagined an eastern wall that would stop the Soviet advance cold. He got a river crossing that cost him 400,000 irreplaceable soldiers. The defensive line that existed only in his fantasies became the Wehrmacht's mass grave. After the Dnieper, the German army never stopped retreating. From this river to Hitler's bunker in Berlin, it would be one long bloody withdrawal. Every defensive line would crumble. Every counterattack would fail. The Wehrmacht had learned a terrible truth at the Dnieper: they weren't an army anymore. They were just men running west, hoping to die on German soil instead of Russian snow. The Battle of the Dnieper proved that the war was lost. Not just the battle, not just the campaign, but the entire war. The mathematics had become impossible. The Soviet Union was producing more men, more tanks, more artillery than Germany could destroy. And now they had proven they could break any defensive line, cross any river, overcome any obstacle. Field Marshal von Manstein, reflecting after the war, wrote, "The Dnieper was where we stopped being soldiers and became fugitives. We knew then that we would retreat until we ran out of Germany." The Eastern Wall had fallen before it was ever built, and with it fell any chance of Nazi Germany surviving the war. The path from the Dnieper led inexorably to one place: a bunker in Berlin, where a failed artist would finally understand that his 1,000-year Reich wouldn't last another 1,000 hours. Every story in history teaches us valuable lessons about strategy, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Thanks for exploring today's story with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to discover more fascinating historical stories with us. See you in the next episode, where strategy and intelligence continue to shape history.